finish up with exactly how SQL Server and Azure SQL Database do auditing in their respective platforms. Okay, so just the concepts here. So compliance is not the same as security. That's the first thing to realize, because a lot of people use the terms interchangeably, including a lot of executives and managers in the companies that we all work in. And there's some very, very important differences here. So the first one of those is that compliance is standard, or both compliance and security are standards based. There are certain things that various people want to see from us. Where the standards come from is different. In some cases, very different, but both are standards based. However, that's about where the similarities end. With compliance, we are focused on risk, specifically the business's risk. For security, however, is more frequently thought to be on the IT side. It's generally more of a technical solution in many cases, and we're focusing on the protection, the actual physical protection of the data, of the machines, what have you, to make sure that to do everything we can to make sure that somebody can't access those machines that is not authorized and does not have the business to do so. Compliance is largely about policies and documentation. A lot of that has to do with just these written guidelines, this written framework that we want to create in all of our companies to be able to say, yes, we comply with this standard that we set out, and be able to prove that to somebody else. Security, however, is much more about the processes. It's about the specific, what we call controls, the actual steps, the technical markers, if you will, to actually implement a specific idea that is laid out in the policies and documentation in practice in our environments. Compliance is mandatory in most cases. There are some standards that are voluntary when talking about compliance, but for the most part, it's mandatory more and more every year. We have compliance requirements from government. We have compliance requirements from our customers, from our business partners. In some cases, many companies are required to comply with the PCI standard, which governs the use of credit cards. If your business takes credit cards, you must comply with PCI DSS version 4 now. It's a very rigorous set of standards, and regardless of how you handle that credit card, whether you have it just on a website, you never actually see it yourself, you've totally outsourced that, or whether you actually have the old paper-based machines back from the 70s and 80s. A few companies still have those. Regardless of which extreme you are or anywhere in between, you have to comply with PCI, and you have no option on that. Security, however, is voluntary in every case. You may have somebody that says, we want you to comply with these security guidelines, but that gets back into compliance again. The act of securing a system is voluntary. Compliance, further, is the minimum. It is always the minimum. Here is the baseline that we have to meet. Security, though, if you do it well, in a secure system, you will exceed the minimum, often far exceeding the minimum. And then finally, compliance is generally infrequent. You are complying like once a year, once every few years. Some standards are moving back toward semi-annually or quarterly compliance requirements. But for the most part, most compliance is on an annual cycle. Security, however, is, again, if you're doing it well, it's going to be a daily exercise. There are going to be certain things that you need to check daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, and so on, in order to be able to keep up with the rapidly changing field of cybersecurity. So with all that in mind, here's my simplified definition of compliance. It's a process of reporting and or proving that you have taken steps to mitigate and or prevent risks to your business. Now, what do you not see in that? Nowhere in that definition do I say anything about technology. This is not, compliance is not an IT function. IT will be involved, IT may guide it, IT may push it, but compliance is not an IT function. It is a business function. It is something that we need to be educating our business people on if they are not already aware of the compliance requirements. We need to take it to them. We need to help them realize what needs to be done and help them make it happen. So just in general, very, very, very quick, high-level set of steps here for compliance. We're going to start by reviewing a specific risk. And to identify those risks, we are going to use these standards, these frameworks that are created for us, regardless of whether it is for a specific governmental body or regulator, or whether it is something like PCI or another contractually obligated standard. Once we know the risk that we are going to mitigate with the compliance, then we are going to build policies, because the policies define what it is that we want to be able to accomplish, broad strokes. Then we create controls, followed by procedures. We're going to document the actions that we take, and then we're going to audit. So with a standard, just to dive a little bit deeper into all of this, with a standard, again, we define the minimum requirements. Standards are generic. There are very few times when you'll have a standard that is very, very specific and just fits your company to a T. It just doesn't happen because they are defined so that they fit a geographical location, a geographical boundary. They are defined for an industry. They're defined for some sort of other vertical. It goes very broadly across many, many companies of all sizes, all financial conditions, and so on. So it will not match your needs precisely. You have to customize your responses to the standards to meet your specific requirements. They're going to change infrequently. And that is part of the reason that security is untethered from the standard. The standards are going to change once every 3 to 5 years, sometimes longer. Just because it does have to apply to so many companies, it's not going to change on a rapid basis. So don't wait for a standard to tell you what to implement for security. It's one thing a lot of companies do wrong, in my opinion, is they are defining what they need to do for security based on what they're required to comply with. That's a good start, but the attackers move much, much more quickly, and they know the standards too. So if you're only meeting the standards, they know exactly what you're going to have in place for security. And that's not the position you want to be in. You want to be ahead of where the attackers are. There are a lot of standards. These are just a few of the most common standards that people are aware of. So probably the most common one is the NIST CSF, which is the cybersecurity framework that is put out by the National Institute of Science and Technology. That is written broadly enough that really anybody in the US and actually globally can use this as kind of a starting standard. And they have some varying degrees in there to help smaller companies comply with this. As I mentioned earlier, most companies anymore will have to comply with PCI to be able to take Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, or any other credit card that's out there. They all are part of this PCI standard body. When you're talking more industrial type companies, you're looking at the ISO 27000 series in many cases. There is a NIST 800 series that is, again, more specific to certain industries. Another one similar to the CSF is the CIS V8. It's just another U.S. government body that also creates these cybersecurity standards. Many companies are SOC compliant. Companies that have to do with finance will have to comply now with FTC safeguards. They actually just released a new version of that last year, and it took a lot of people by surprise because they were only given 6 months to completely change the way that they're complying or start complying in the first place. You've got HIPAA and high tech for healthcare. You've got CMMC for any company that has a government contract. I could go on and on. There's all sorts of standards here. And now we're also adding privacy standards like the GDPR, which applies to Europe, and actually more specifically applies to European citizens. So if you do business with a European citizen, regardless of where they live, the GDPR applies to you. You have to comply with those requirements. Similarly, CPRA is for people who live in California. It's designed to protect their privacy. If you do business with California residents, you have to comply with the CPRA. We have about a dozen states now which have their own version of data privacy laws, either in effect now or will be in effect within the next 12 to 18 months. There are another 25 or so states that have regulations going through the legislative process, similar to the GDPR and CPRA. Many other countries have data privacy laws on the books now. One big characteristic of all of these new data privacy laws is that they have teeth. They have really, really big teeth. The GDPR is the classic example. The regulators have very, very broad discretion on what penalties to apply, depending on how egregious your privacy violations were. But they can go up to 4% of your global revenue in the worst case scenarios for each year in which you failed to comply with GDPR. And they have actually, I believe, handed down at least one now that is that strict of a penalty. So it is happening. This is here, and it is something that you need to really, really pay attention to. The nice thing is that there are some commonalities with all of these standards. So each standard will have literally hundreds of controls. If you look at the PCI DSS version 4 in its kind of worst case scenario, because they have varying levels of compliance within that standard. If you're a very small business that only has a website that is outsourced to somebody that's already proven compliant, so Square would be one example, Intuit has one, so on and so forth. If you completely outsource to that, you'll have about 25 questions for PCI DSS, and the number of points of compliance is similar. It's like 25 or 30. On the other end of that, you have their most strict requirements, and you have approximately 500 different controls that have to be implemented in your organizations. And that's one of the more reasonable ones. There's some of them that are much closer to 1,000 different controls. And you probably will have to comply with more than one standard. But the nice thing is that there are a number of places that the standards will overlap. And so the next few slides are just a brief listing of some of those that tend to be very common among this. It's just as examples. You're talking about specific controls for we need to have passwords that are unique and complex. We need to have passwords that are 12 characters long. We need to have passwords that are rotated every 90 days to prevent reuse. You can't reuse more than once every 2 years. You have to encrypt passwords when they're being transmitted. You have to use multi-factor authentication. This is one reason that so many companies are implementing MFA now, besides just the fact that it's a really good idea. A lot of standards are requiring it. Likewise, for having separate local administrator accounts, a lot of companies are going to this, and again, it's something that's being pushed by the standards. Some of them are very, very obvious. You have to approve new users before you grant access to the data. They can't have access before they're an employee. That's standard, or one of the controls. You have to encrypt a mobile device. So your laptop, you have to use Bitdefender or a third party, which does the same thing. If you have an iOS device or a Mac or an Android device, all of these now have encryption for the disk built in, and the standards say you have to turn that on. You have to use it. You have to include security and privacy controls when you're developing software. You have to control physical access to the data systems. So you have to have a key card to get into the server room. You may need to say only certain people can get into the server room. When I was first in IT 30 years ago, we used to leave the server room doors standing wide open. Anybody could walk in and do anything they wanted to, and in some cases they did. But you can't do that anymore. You have to maintain audit logs. You have to maintain an inventory and keep it updated. And then you have to perform risk assessments. A lot of the standards still say annual. This is like penetration tests, vulnerability scans, and so on. Most of the standards will say annual still. Some, like PCI DSS version 4, have started mandating quarterly. This is coming. We have to do more assessments. We have to stay on top of this more, and that's all being pushed by these standards bodies. And then finally, we have to document. Compliance, the hardest part about compliance in most cases is the requirements for documentation. What they want you to do, if you're doing compliance the way that they would really like to see, is you want to document everything. If you change a setting to enable multi-factor authentication, they want to see a record of that, preferably in some form like a screenshot or perhaps a PDF file that is not easily altered. A lot of auditors will want to see like a timestamp on that record so that they know that you didn't just fake it 10 minutes before they got there, because that does happen on a regular basis. And some of the documentation that companies put together now with this can be in the hundreds of pages. It's not something that you're going to look through all the time. You may never look through it in a normal scenario, but they want you to have it to be able to prove if the worst happens, whether the worst is that you're audited, or whether the worst is that you have an incident, that you have that record that you did what you said you were going to do. And that is what protects you from the liability. That's what allows you to get back to good in the least amount of time possible. One other one I want to highlight is the need for training. A lot of companies aren't doing this well yet, but they do want you to have regular training on not only on how to be secure, but also on your plans within your company. They want you to keep it updated. They want you to have ongoing training, not just once when you start your employment with the company, like we used to do years ago. And they want you to prepare incident response plans and then test those. I don't think we talk in here very much about tabletop exercises, but tabletops are a great way to test an incident response plan or disaster recovery plan. Because the last thing you want is for your company to actually experience a cyber incident, whether it's ransomware or whether it's something else, and not know if your plan works. I've been there. It's not fun, and it really becomes a mess if you don't already know that everything is going to work. So you need to do those tabletop exercises, which is kind of like a Dungeons and Dragons game, honestly, to be able to walk through and make sure that, yes, this does actually work the way that we think it's going to when it's put to the test. Okay, so we've talked about the standards or the compliance that is pushed by the standards bodies, whether that's regulators or whether that's these larger industry specific or geographical standards bodies. But insurance is also pushing it. Cyber insurance, every company should now have cyber insurance. It is becoming more difficult to get. It is becoming more expensive as the losses have mounted with the insurance companies, because they have to cover their risk as well. But it's becoming a must-have because it's so costly to recover from a cyber incident. But in return for that, for those high premiums, you get a lot. If you have a full cybersecurity policy, not only will they cover the losses from the direct impacts to your business or to your customers, but they will take care of arranging the forensics, which forensic specialists are hideously expensive. All the legal support that you're going to need to not only wade through the regulations and be able to figure out what you need to do for each state that or country that has people affected by your breach, but also to protect you from the lawsuits that may happen afterward on an ongoing basis. Hardware replacement, data recovery. Every state, every jurisdiction has different breach notifications. They help you with that. They help, in many cases, they'll also help you with not only negotiating the ransom, but also making the payments themselves. So the insurance company does a lot more than we would necessarily think on the surface. But as I mentioned, it's becoming harder to get. Claims are going up more than 100% annually, year over year. Premiums are also therefore increasing rapidly. In some cases, people have seen upwards of 300%. But the nice thing is that if you comply with their standards, and they are using their own standards to cut across all of the other industry standards, in many cases, they're cherry picking what they like. But if you are able to demonstrate compliance, your premiums will drop dramatically because they know that putting this stuff in place works. So that's a lot of information. This is very deep stuff. This is only touching on it just at a very high level. But this is what we're dealing with. This is what we're going for. This is what it takes to mitigate that business risk, as opposed to just implementing technical requirements. Okay, so now that we know what we're aiming at for the compliance, what do we need to, as DBAs and developers, what do we need to audit? And the short answer is everything. We need to audit everything from login changes, to what privileged accounts that you have, to what encryption are you using, to what connection requests fail. When you apply a patch, when you're doing backups, restores, are you testing your restores? Are you making changes to the database that would affect the integrity of the data? In a best case scenario, you'll also be tracking the lineage of the data. You'll be tracking the flow of the data. So this employee ID or this person's name, that's being copied from system A to system B to system C, and it's been being used on reports on system D, and it's being sent out to third party A, B, and C as part of our business with them. You want to track the flow and the lineage of all of this data to be able, again, to document that, yes, you do know where your data is. You do know what you have. You do know it's being protected because you know where it is and where it's going. That's just in SQL Server itself. When we talk about the server level, the Windows level, or Linux, if you're using Linux, you also have to log some of the same things there too. Logins, passwords, privileged accounts, permissions, RDP access, who has it, what are they doing with it? What are your administrators doing? I've had some companies that actually go so far as to record on video every time an administrator works on the server. And they will actually have a group that goes back and reviews those videos on a periodic basis. Failed logins, patches, unauthorized access, software changes, physical access perhaps. Basically anything at that server level that could impact your data. Other things that you probably want to audit around both of these, what are you doing for data loss prevention? Are you using something like the information protection labels that are available in Azure? Are you using ledger tables in SQL Server or some other kind of immutable storage for your data, regardless of where it is? You want to be able to audit things on your network. You want to audit things at the hypervisor level if you're using virtual machines. If you're in the cloud, you want to make sure that you're auditing any changes to Azure or AWS or whatever cloud you're using. You want to audit firewall changes. And then every once in a while, you want to go back and double check your inventory. Actually do an inventory like a store does to make sure that they haven't had any, that they know how many items they have. You really want to know how many servers you have, how many databases you have. And you want to make sure that you caught everything. So do a ground up search every once in a while just to confirm that. And then audit your data itself to ensure that you know and can prove that your data is what you think it is. And then finally, other systems that are maybe associated with your databases, application servers, reporting servers, analysis servers, Fabric, your Entra ID for Azure Active or Azure Active Directory, your key storage for like Azure Key Vault or KMS on AWS, blob storage, and then any auditing and monitoring systems that you may have. You really, really want to audit everything in a best case scenario, because that is what's going to head off that auditor that comes in and is looking for what you did wrong. Because if the worst happens and if you have some sort of a breach, they are going to be going through everything with a fine-tooth comb looking for the one thing that you did wrong so that the insurance company can avoid paying that claim, or so that that person that's suing you will be able to win their case. It is far better for you to do this work up front and know what they're going to find than to be caught off guard by it in the end after something does happen. Because at that point, it's far too late. Okay, so now that we know what we need to audit, let's see how we do it actually in SQL Server. And it's not necessarily easy. SQL Server was not designed for audits. When we first started using SQL Server when it first came out back in the 80s, you didn't audit your database servers. You didn't audit anything. At most, you might have an audit for how many servers do you have, just to get inventory. But you definitely didn't have all of these things built into SQL Server to be able to track all of the movement and all of the settings within the databases. All of this was added after the fact, starting with SQL 2005. That's when they added the security model that we know today. Before that, it was very, very open. There's still relics of that within SQL. But the security model that we know today, they started adding those users, adding those permissions, all the hierarchy that we have, and they've continued to improve it even up through SQL 2022. SQL Audit was added in SQL 2008. TDE was also added in 2008, always encrypted in 2016, ledger tables in SQL 2022. All of these things are bolted on. It's not designed into the core. And we see things like, pieces of this like sysadmin still to this day has no restrictions. And anybody can be a sysadmin if they're given the role. The permission model, the way most people implement it, is subtractive. It's not additive. So you start out with all the permissions, and then people take stuff away. And even that, in many companies still don't even do that. They just say, oh, well, you need access to X system, so we're going to give you all the access to the database. There's no auditing turned on by default. There's no security logging turned on by default, except for failed logins. There's no reports that make it simple to pull this information. It's all stuff that you have to add on or build after the fact. So there's a number of different things we can do in order to gain this auditing data that I said we need to grab. First option, you can build your own. It's a lot of work. There's going to be some things that you do need to build on your own because there just aren't, to this day, aren't tools to really be able to put that together easily, especially within databases. There are very few third-party tools which have the capability to actually do the security auditing and logging that you might want. So you have to build some of this yourself. You can use trace and profile, or you can use extended events. There's certain things that those are great for. Temporal tables can be good for this, along with ledger tables, depending on whether you need to track the changes over time, and then with ledger tables, whether you need those changes to be recorded immutably. Then there's also SQL to audit, and as I mentioned, third-party software, a limited amount. Many of us are familiar with temporal tables, so I'm not going to go deep into that, but those automatically track changes. They're simple to create. They're simple to have those historical records, but it's possible to alter that data, that historical data. You can delete data. You can fake some of these records because there's no way to independently verify that, and there's no way to stop a sysadmin from making any changes to it. A ledger table, on the other hand, takes that a step further. They add that independent verification. They make it so that a sysadmin cannot make changes to these tables without anybody knowing. That was introduced in SQL 2022. If you haven't investigated ledger tables yet, definitely do it. It's a fantastic implementation and innovation, and I've really become a huge fan of it. The biggest thing is that this is independently verified because they use a blockchain. At first, when I heard about this, I thought it sounded like a gimmick. But really what the blockchain is used for in this case is to be able to have those known hashes. They have the blockchain concept, which means that those records are immutable. They cannot be changed under any circumstances without somebody knowing. It's a little more complicated to set up and use. It's relatively new. A lot of people don't know about it, but it's very powerful. and it's available both in Azure and on SQL 2022. And then we have SQL Server Audit. As I mentioned, SQL Audit was introduced in SQL 2008, enhanced in SQL 2012. It does use extended events to keep detailed records without putting too much of a load on the system, not nearly as much as Trace would. You can trap that. One big pro about SQL Audit is that unlike any of the other methods that I showed you or talked about a moment ago, you can trap all actions, including selects, with SQL Audit. And that's very, very powerful. In some cases, the compliance requirements are moving toward the need to be able to record select statements, especially on certain tables or in certain circumstances. You have some controls over whether administrators can make changes to the auditing. If they can make changes, it can't be done without somebody knowing about it. One big con is that before SQL 2022, this wasn't independent of the sysadmin. You had to be that sysadmin role to be able to create, to start, to view and audit. That's no longer the case. We have more granular permissions now, but that has been a traditional weakness. The other thing is that it's hard to set up, or it can be, and the data accumulates extremely rapidly. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so how do we set this up? I'm going to spend some time on SQL Audit because it is such a good tool for the types of things that we're talking about. Really, there's three pieces to setting up an audit. There is the server audit, which defines the parameters for the storage of all of this. There is the audit specification, which says the server audit specification and the database audit specification, which then define what to capture at the instance level and the database level, respectively. You output these to files, you can output them to the Windows logs, and you can also have the option to force the SQL Server to fail or shut down if for whatever reason the audit cannot run, whether that is you run out of disk space, whether that is somebody turns it off. You have that option to force that shutdown so that the actions must be audited. As far as when you're talking about creating these definitions that go into the audit specifications, it gets a little fun. This is where it starts to get a little bit funky. Because even though this is using extended events, and extended events really don't have a lot of commonalities with Trace. When they built SQL Audit, they based these audit classes on the event classes that exist in Trace, even though there's not really a good mapping back to extended events. That can make it hard to figure out what goes in what bucket. You can't enable individual extended events for an audit. You have to enable the event classes, and that gets a little bit murky. And then to make it even worse, the list of classes and the events that go with them has varied by the version of SQL you're on. This has gotten better in recent years, but it's still out there that it is not consistent between versions of SQL. When it comes to the audit classes, you also have three levels that these exist at. The server level and the database level, of course, to go with those two audit specifications, and then the audit level. There's a few that will allow you to trap events that affect the audit itself. There are filters that go along with all of this. You can filter on any field recorded by the audit. And there's a couple catches to this, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But any field, there's about 20 different fields that are recorded by the audits for any given event. It is not everything that you can trap with an extended event. It's limited to these like 20 or so specific fields. And you need to make sure you're keeping the filters simple. And again, we'll talk about that more in a minute, but those do exist so that you can winnow down the events that are trapping or getting trapped by any given audit. For once you have created the audit, once it's been running for a while, you're going to want to be able to pull this out. You can do that either with T-SQL, which is the primary method of consuming these logs. There also is, in some cases, a viewer built into SSMS, but most of the time, just because it gives me a lot more control over what I'm pulling, I will go ahead and use that T-SQL. One thing to know here, as I mentioned on the slide, times are always in UTC for SQL audit. Even if your server is using a specific local time zone, audit records it in UTC. Okay, so that's the broad strokes on what audit can do and how it's set up. But there's some very notable limitations which I want to make you aware of. One is that data accumulates with an audit very, very rapidly. I have seen many people that start out with trying to use SQL audit. They go in and they turn on everything because they think they eventually want to know everything. I have seen cases where you end up with audit files that are growing at the rate of a gigabyte per minute. Needless to say, your server disk space doesn't last long when you have it set up like that. You have to make sure that you are filtering extremely aggressively when you're defining your specifications. Only pull the information you absolutely need. If you only need to audit one specific database, only audit that database. If you only need to audit on a specific table, filter down to that table, so on and so forth. These audit files, because they are external binary compressed files, that's what the XEL format is. This is not optimized for reading. It's optimized for getting data into it to try and avoid any excess impact on the server when it's being written. They did not optimize reading. It can be very, very slow. The larger the file gets, the worse it gets. And forget about searching. There's almost no searching capabilities built into this. And then finally, as mentioned before, the data points are not comprehensive. You just simply can't get the same amount of data out of a SQL audit that you can get out of an extended event. That's by design, because you are intending to trap a lot of data over a long period of time, unlike with an extended event. Filters are pretty limited. You only have certain simple operators. You don't have things like in or between. You are limited to the basic mathematical operators plus the like. You only have integers and strings. The filter predicates are limited to 3,000 characters, which sounds great, except that when you save the filter predicate, when you're defining it, regardless of whether you're saving it through SSMS or whether you're creating these through a T-SQL command, SQL rewrites this for you, whether you want it to or not. And it is very verbose. So rather than doing an in, which it can't do, it will put 5 different equals statements into that filter. And because it has to use the fully qualified field name in each case, that gets very wordy very quickly. It will add its own parentheses. It'll remove parentheses for you. It'll rearrange terms based on the way it thinks that you should have it. And then there's a few, to top it all off, there's a couple of filter criteria, namely action ID and class type, that require an integer code. One of those two, and I can't remember, not remembering which one off the top of my head, but one of those two is not documented by Microsoft anywhere. The other one, I think it's class type. It actually, matter of fact, I know it's class type, actually has a catalog view that you can go and pull the class types and be able to get those integer codes. Action ID does not. There is one person that has documented that on the internet. It's become the Bible for anybody doing anything like this. And he had to do it by trial and error. When you're looking at the server audit specification versus the database audit specification, moving on from filters, when you're looking at those two and trying to decide what events you actually want to capture using these event classes, there's what appears to be overlap between the events that you can trap at the server level and the events that you can trap at the database level. One example is for data modification, trapping inserts, for example, or updates. There is a very similar sounding event class on both, but they work in very different ways in some cases between the server level and the database level. One very notable difference is that the server level events exclude some of the details about the queries that you would get at the database level, making it impossible to trace it back. Because of this, there's also no good way to take these audit events and be able to expand on it using extended events or something, because there's no correlation IDs in con. And a couple of really big issues, a couple of really big issues for those that are using this to track security is that within a database, any member of sysadmin is recorded as being DBO, because a sysadmin becomes DBO when they're in the context of a database, no matter what. SQL knows no different. Sysadmin always is DBO. And so you can't see if a specific sysadmin is making a change or viewing data that they shouldn't. Windows group login auditing is also not good, because if you there is no way, for example, if you want to track all domain admins, you can't do it, because SQL at this level does not ever see the group domain admins. When you log into SQL Server as a member of a group, it translates that back to your Windows ID, and that's the identifier that you're roaming around the server with. There is nowhere in SQL that it knows at that point that you are a member of that group beyond the time when it's doing a permissions check. And so it records your user, not the group, and that can be very misleading. If you have a group member that does not have a login within a database, which is a very, very common practice, it's reported as the public role. So it's not even tied to the group at that point, not tied to your user. It's just reported as public, which is absolutely useless. And to top it off, there's no way to filter on those Windows group logins. Again, we can only filter on what it can see. All it can see is the actual user, and so there's no way to actually trap that. These are some very large limitations. I'm not trying to tell you not to use SQL Audit because of this, but you need to be aware of this so that you can make the appropriate accommodations when you do set it up. It's very, very powerful. I do encourage people to use it, but just go in with eyes open and know what it can and cannot do, so you can use it successfully. For auditing Azure SQL database, the nice thing is that they didn't reinvent the wheel. The security, the auditing capabilities within Azure SQL database and managed instances all built on SQL Server Audit. It uses the same .xcl file format. You consume it via the same function. So it's there's a lot of similarities. If you learn SQL Server Audit on premises, you'll be able to use SQL Server Audit in the cloud. The differences are basically in how you set it up. With Azure SQL Database, you have to set it up from the portal. It's got a default configuration. In some cases, you can't modify that, at least not a lot. You can do a little bit of modification through CLI or PowerShell or the rest, but you're very limited. It's designed to be just essentially plug and play auditing. You turn it on and it audits stuff. SQL Managed Instance takes a similar approach where they're going to allow you limited amounts of flexibility as far as the setup, but it's just a few button presses and you have auditing. You have more control in that you can do the full audit specifications and such for Managed Instance, but it's designed for simplicity. Log targets, because you're in the cloud, of course, are different. In some cases, better. You can use Azure Blob Storage, which means that you can make them immutable. You also have the ability to directly pipe this in from Azure SQL into a log analytics workspace or an Azure Event Hub. There are limited ways that you can direct the output from SQL Server Audit into a couple of the major SIEM tools. So one that I know of that exists is Splunk. It has the capability to consume SQL audit data. Azure tools obviously can consume SQL audit data from on-prem. You have a little bit more flexibility in the cloud because it's designed for the cloud. They have the direct capability to just push it straight into log analytics to be able to be reviewed through Sentinel or Purview. You also have the ability to monitor Microsoft support activities, which is very important when you're in the cloud as well. One big caveat that you need to know about if you're using Entra ID, and SQL Server Audit in Azure can record successful Entra logins, but because a failure in Entra authentication happens before it gets to SQL, SQL doesn't know about that failed login, and therefore it cannot track failed Entra logins. So you have to do that within the Entra part of the portal. It's there, but it's just not going to be integrated with your SQL logins, SQL audits. And then in Azure also, you do have a couple of additional extensions. You do have the threat detection, which is part now of the Microsoft Defender for SQL Server. And then you have the option to use Azure Monitor to get some real-time analytics, to get some specific audit events, and be able to trap. Azure Monitor can also import certain logs from on-premises SQL, so that you can have that holistic auditing capability. So that's really the content that I've got for tonight. It's a lot of information. I'm happy to go back through any of that if you have any questions or want me to review any of it. But given all of that, one thing that a lot of people do that causes any initiative like beginning to audit to fail is trying to do everything at once. Companies will decide that they're going to do this one big push in order to get compliant, and they take months or years to put all of this in place, all at one time. It's kind of like the waterfall approach versus a much more agile approach. When you're talking about security auditing, an agile style approach works much, much better. And these are the places that I would start. First of all, track your failed logins. It already does this to some extent through the error log, but that's very, very difficult in the amount of to parse through, and the amount of information you get out of it is very small. So track the failed logins. Start by tracking the logins for the super users. So anybody with sysadmin, SA, or DBO. That's increasingly important in so many of the standards out there. It's almost universal now that you have to be able to prove what those privileged users did. Track role changes. This sounds simple until you think about certain scenarios where somebody is able to use privilege escalation to change their own role or change the role of a standard user to a privileged user. This is important for being able to head off an attack, because one of the first things that any attacker will do is try to give themselves more privileges. DDL, so any changes to the table schemas, and then any changes to the audits themselves. If you start by tracking these 5 things, you'll already be ahead of a lot of companies out there, and you'll be well on your way to do a successful auditing program. Does anybody have any questions? I ran through a whole lot of stuff. Hopefully I wasn't going too fast.
Yeah. Got one.
Oh. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was calling it out for you because I don't know if you could see a hand up in that video. So
I can't actually, but
okay, right, of course. Yeah, so just for clarification, the whole compliance and then auditing. So is insurance, do insurance companies reduce your premium when you are shown to be just compliant, or is the whole idea to basically audit everything yourself to be compliant? Because it didn't make sense, when you were explaining earlier that you can be compliant, but that's not necessarily everything you need to do, right?
Right. That is a fantastic question, and I'm definitely glad you asked that. Here's the way that insurance companies do it currently, because again, they're trying to cut across the standards. They don't want to have one policy for HIPAA and one policy for healthcare, one policy for a financial advisor, one policy for an accounting firm, one policy for a bookkeeper, and so on. What they do is they give you a questionnaire. In every case that I've seen, they will give you a questionnaire. It's self-assessment. And so it's basically on the honor system. This is where their own standards come into play. Some companies still just have a 1 or 2 page form with a dozen questions on it, very basic stuff like, do you back up your systems? Do you have a password policy? Do you have multi-factor authentication in place? Have you reviewed your logs in the last 6 months? Very basic, very broad questions like that. There are some of the insurance carriers that are now going very, very deep, and the self-assessment questionnaire, they're still using it. This is still a self-assessment, but there's some of them that are now in the tens or dozens of pages. I've heard some as high as 60 or 70 pages. There's one that I was told about that they give you a spreadsheet, which looks very simple to start with, but as you keep answering questions, it exposes more. It actually unhides things. And I know somebody who actually spent 2 weeks, 8 hours a day, to fill out this Excel-based insurance questionnaire, because it ended up being something like 75 different tabs. And absolutely insane as far as the level of detail. You fill out the regardless of which extreme it is, you fill out this self-assessment questionnaire when you apply for the policy. They review that questionnaire and they give you the policy based solely on your answers on that questionnaire. They don't check your audits at this point in time. They don't check to see if you've actually done any of the stuff that you said you were going to do. Instead, they wait until you've had an incident. And then you're in trouble. Because there's a lot of companies right now that are not taking this seriously. And there's some companies that will just have an administrative assistant just go down and check without knowing anything about the security of the company. There's some that are handing it off to IT, and the IT person will go down and check the 6 boxes that they know of, and then they leave some questions off, or they don't have complete answers. There's all sorts of ways that companies are doing this, but the catch is that the insurance company is going to then, when you have an incident, when you're filing a claim, they're going to take not just a magnifying glass, but like an electron microscope to this questionnaire, and they're going to compare it to everything that you have in your environment. And if your environment does not meet or exceed everything you said in that questionnaire, your claim will be denied. So in some ways, it's kind of sneaky. But that's the way that they're doing it. That's the way a lot of the standards bodies are doing it now too, for especially regulators. You attest to it, or you get somebody to attest to it up front. And then if an incident happens where you're in violation, then they go back and they take a fine-tooth comb to it, and they will catch you on every little thing you did wrong. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And not only that, you may have done something correctly, but if it's something that can't be shown actively today, and you don't have some type of definitive proof of it, they're going to deny. It's like court, right? If you don't have proof, it never actually happened.
Right.
Right.
And that's the reason for the insane level of documentation.
Yeah.
One thing that a lot of people don't realize you can do on the cyber insurance questionnaires is you're not limited, even if it's a 1-page form, you're not limited to just putting a checkbox on each one of those and calling it good. Attach extra information. If something doesn't apply to you, leave the question off and tell them why. If you have, if it's a question about multi-factor authentication and you are in the process as of the day you're applying of switching from Microsoft Authenticator to Okta, and you have it enabled for this group, and this group, but you can't do the service accounts yet because of this package that you're using, or because of this location, or you have some sort of jurisdiction that's requiring something else, whatever your reason. Whenever you're filling out one of these questionnaires, don't think of it as I will, or I might, or I should. It needs to be, this is where I am today. Let them judge you based on where you are today. And if your rate sucks, you'll have the opportunity to improve that later. Because you can go back and say, hey, we've done these 6 things, and on your next renewal, and we should get a better rate. They do that all the time. But you need to be very, very truthful, because if you say that we've got multi-factor authentication in place, but it's only for certain pieces of your company, they're going to catch that if you actually have an incident, and your claim is going to get denied.
And I'd like to say, there's a part of me that wants to be like, these greedy, but at the same time,
Yep.
Right, at the same time, if you have a whole bunch of breaches and everybody didn't do what they were supposed to do, the system falls apart. Right? That's the problem with insurance, is if you're taking care of everybody and paying out money, all of a sudden, we don't have any money to pay out the next guy that really needs it, right? And so they have to make sure if you say you're doing this, great, we'll cover you. But if you say you're doing it and you didn't do it, now you just put yourself at risk, which really puts us at risk. Now I got to give you money. So no, sorry, you didn't do what you're supposed to do. Right?
Yep.
You may not have had a breach if you had done what you said you were doing.
Right.
So.
And they are not necessarily going to deny you the insurance plan in the first place because you don't have everything on their questionnaire in place. There's certain non-negotiables, but they tell you what those are. Password policy, non-negotiable. MFA is becoming a non-negotiable, but they tell you these things. And if you go down through this 2-page application and you are able to positively affirmatively answer a third of the questions that say, yes, we have these in place, you can say another 4 of them that, okay, well, these are planned for this year, but they're not in place yet. And the rest, they either don't apply to you or, nope, we don't have that in place. Your premium may not be as good, but in many cases, you'll still get that policy. You don't have to be perfect. They're not looking for perfect. They're looking for better. They're looking for you taking those positive steps and making efforts to do the things that you should be doing. But even more than that, being truthful about it. So hopefully that helps.
I don't know much about these particular insurance policies in this regard, but my guess is, just like other things, hey, I've added an alarm system to my house. Can we go back and renegotiate the premiums, right? Probably depending on the contract and stuff like that. But you think about that, right? We don't have this today. We're going to have it. You go back when you have it. Look what we did. Anyway, we can renegotiate these things. And then they're going to go to their adjusters, and the adjusters are going to plug these in and say, well, now they're 10% less likely to have a breach. So, whatever that translates to, let's just assume 10% cheaper.
Yep.
Right?
I'm sure exactly right.
Simple, but
from the insurance company's perspective, this is all just risk. It doesn't matter whether the risk is from fire or whether it's from a hurricane or whether it's from cyber liability. It's all just risk, and they plug it into the same types of models with regards to how much are we losing, how much are we gaining with premiums, and what's it going to take for us to be able to cover our risk. And yeah, they do that type of thing all the time, from what I understand. Just like with any other type of policy. The biggest difference is that we are not used to yet taking cybersecurity seriously when it comes to insurance. We're just not. On the whole, some companies are, but on the whole, we're not. In 100 years, it'll look exactly like fire does now. It's just absolutely routine. Every building has certain things that are required by code. They're required by the insurance companies in order to protect against a fire. And guess what? We don't have very many fires. And it's just, you don't even think about it. Yeah, you have a sprinkler system in a business building because that's just what you do. We'll get there with cybersecurity. We're just not there yet. What other questions do you guys have? Anybody running into this in their companies right now? Or I should say, how many of you are running into this type of thing? How many are you starting these types of efforts? Nobody? You are, okay. So I was hoping there was at least somebody.
Because I can say, if any of you use Azure, or if this pops into your Google feed or your whatever news feed, Microsoft is forcing, if we haven't already, every Azure tenant is going to be forced, and they're going to turn on MFA. Why? Because they're sick of people coming and getting, well, we didn't turn it on. Okay, fine, babies. We're going to take care of you like mom and turn it on across the board, right? Because we're darned if we do and we're darned if we don't. We're probably more darned if we don't. And so because it's so commonplace, you're seeing that now.
And that's only going to continue.
Yep.
My suggestion is even though you may not be required to for any reason to start or to be doing these audits, pick out some areas and start anyway. Because it's going to get to the point probably sooner than later where you will have to be doing this. You will be required. Whether that's an edict from management or an edict from the government or the insurance carrier. It's a massive task. It's a monumental undertaking. Individually, pieces don't take that long to start auditing. And it's a snowball effect because once you start it, yeah, you have to maintain it, but it's not nearly as much as it is to get it started. So don't wait for somebody to come in and say, now you need to start auditing. Get a running start, get a head start on it. And maybe somebody else will follow your example. Ross, did you have a question?
Well, not a question, just a comment. We answer, our company answers to the SEC, the CFTC, and the Fed. All of them, particularly the SEC, tells us we have to have those things in place. Mm-hmm. If we don't have those things in place, we're fine.
Yep.
So we've had those safeguards in place for years.
Yeah, SOX was actually one of the very early ones. And for healthcare, that was another one. People know HIPAA more, but the law that actually governs cybersecurity is the HITECH Act for healthcare. Some of these segments have been doing it for years. Some of them have been saying they've been doing it. Some companies have been saying they've been doing it for years, even in those sectors, and not really taking it seriously. They've been just doing the bare minimum, which is why you're seeing so many breaches in healthcare right now, honestly. So yeah, start taking steps toward it.
HIPAA is the reason that I can't call up a healthcare provider that my wife uses and discuss with them about anything, even a bill for crying out.
Yep. Well, if nobody has any other questions, thank you very much for having me. I've definitely enjoyed talking with you guys tonight. Hopefully it was useful for you as well. I will get a copy of my slide deck up to Ross and Jared so that if anybody wants it, they can grab it from you guys, if that's okay. And
sure. Thank you.
If anybody comes to Summit, please look me up. And hopefully next time I'll be able to make it work to get out there to talk to you sometime. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen.
Yeah, thank you, Ed.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good night.
So one thing that we do at these meetings, and I don't think Ross, I kind of heard him when I was out there,